Now, anyone whose fixed term comes to an end the next year or so is likely to see a very big hike in their repayments after the Bank of England raised the base rate to 5%. Now, we know it's going to be painful, but just how painful? Well, to help us answer that question, I'm joined now by mortgage broker Sally Mitchell from the Mortgage Mum and the Economist Vicky Pryce. Good morning and welcome to both of you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Vicky, can I just start with you, please? Because I have a feeling that the Bank of England, the government, economists in general, they are very good at blinding us all with charts and justification for the things that they do. But actually, when it comes down to it, this is how what they do affects real people, and it's going to be bad, isn't it?
Absolutely. And the interesting thing is that the Bank of England raised rates by 50 basis points. In other words, not just by the 0.25% that we all thought, but by the 50%, which in a way calmed the markets because they had anticipated anyway that there could possibly be, because of the inflation rate recalculations that were taking place, we're going to have higher inflation, therefore interest rates had to be higher. They anticipated another 4 quarter point increases at least. So the Bank of England, moved in quickly. At least this time it did, and the markets have sort of not necessarily, raised all the other rates, as much as perhaps you would have thought. But in fact, they've come down a bit, and even sterling has come down a bit. And the reason for that is they think that this is actually a very serious move. It is going to affect lots of people, just as you're suggesting, and therefore it is the likelihood of recession has come closer, and that's why, in fact, the markets are now repricing what's going to happen next. So they're quite pessimistic about the UK economy, and I think this interest rate increase sort of more or less confirms it.
Are they pessimistic about it? Because I've read, Sally, reports that say that this is not the end of the pain, that in fact we could go up as high as 6.
Yeah, that's what I've been told and what I've read. We're certainly not out of the woods yet. And of course, anything that happens with the interest rate, it takes a while for that to actually trickle down. There are people who are coming to the end of their fixed rates in the next 6 months or year who are going to be affected. So I was talking to someone literally 5 minutes ago who said their rate doesn't end for 2 years, but they're already worried because they're looking at changing from a 1.9%, which they can just about afford, to, 6.19 at the moment, the average, and perhaps in 6 months or a year, it's going to be more than that.
It is indeed. And I mean, one of the things that I heard an economist say earlier this past week was that the bank has got to learn from the mistakes that it's made in the past. I have to say that that set alarm bells ringing for me. Does that suggest to you that perhaps the Bank of England and indeed the government in general has been a bit cavalier with what they're doing with interest rates and how they're playing with trying to keep inflation down but putting interest rates up, and have not really thought out what effect this is going to have on the general public?
I don't know who you're asking, but I can
Sally,
jump in
would
if you
like to answer? Yes.
I'm so sorry. That did feel like an economist's question.
Sorry.
Yes, I have seen the headlines, the plank of England. And I think when it all hits the fan, it's very easy to point fingers and blame. Certainly the way, and I'm sure Vicky will probably concur, I hope, that we try and control inflation is by raising interest rates. And they say if it's not hurting, it's not working. Well, it's certainly hurting people. We have seen inflation come down, not as quickly. It's not coming down as quickly as they hoped. That spooked the market a month ago. But if the idea is to stop people spending and to cut money supply down, then that is exactly what is happening. So in a weird sort of economic way, it's working. But of course, it's so hard for the people on the receiving end.
Vicky, will you please pick up that answer then? Because, as I say, it did set alarm bells ringing for me. If they're talking about learning from the mistakes that they've made in the past, they've been doing this yo-yoing with mortgage rates and everything else for years now. What lessons do they have to learn that they shouldn't already have learned?
Well, it's interesting because when you look at what the Bank of England has done, in fact, it raised interest rates before it started raising interest rates after everyone reduced their rates, the central banks, because of COVID, earlier than the US, earlier than the European Central Bank. So actually, you could argue that they were on top of the situation. And of course, at the time, we still didn't know how important and the increases for energy costs were going to be on both businesses and the consumer. But the interesting thing is that interest rates are almost as high now as they are in the US, and the US has seen a drop in inflation, almost a halving in inflation. We haven't seen that. The European Central Bank only started raising rates last July. It was still negative as of last July, which is extraordinary, their main deposit rate. And yet their inflation there is also a lot more manageable. So there you have places like Spain with only 3% inflation, for example. You have France at 5%. So there is something wrong in terms of the structure of the economy, I think, which is making the job of the Bank of England much more difficult. First of all, we've lost lots of workers. In the areas where inflation is happening, such as the service sector, it's in places like entertainment, it's hospitality, it's retail, it's tourism. And those are the areas where EU workers were very prominent. They're not there anymore. So staff costs are going up. But if you look at services overall, what you see is that input prices, apart from staff, are really falling now. They're slowing down and also almost falling in some areas such as petrol and everything else, energy. It's staff where the issues are, and they're passing it on, of course, to the consumer. There is one other very quick thing that I can mention on this, which is that we stepped in so late to support energy costs for individuals. We stepped in late for businesses. We've done very little on the food price front. What has happened across Europe is completely different. And I think we have encouraged inflation expectations to be high, hence wage demands, strikes, and everything else of the sort that we don't see in other countries.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, very briefly, I wonder when we're talking about this being the highest rate for 15 years, whether or not we actually just all got used to having cheap money. And we now have to accept that the banks are saying that actually we cannot run the economy and we cannot run banks on 0% or 1%. We have to put up the increase.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to see those, I call them COVID rates, again for a very, very long time, if ever. The new norm, I believe, in a couple of years will be about 4.5% for borrowing, for mortgages, certainly. And what we've got to remember, although it's the highest rate for 15 years, but we borrowed less money back then. I remember it being 13, 14% easily, but we were borrowing twice our incomes, our annual incomes for mortgages. These days, we're borrowing 4.5 as a minimum. So it feels, although it's only 5%, it does feel like it's 13% to the people who are sitting in their homes, wondering how on earth they're going to pay it.
Yes, as you say, cheap money, a thing of the past. Thank you both very much indeed for joining us today. Thank you, Vicky and Sally Mitchell. Thank you. Now, this